In 1 Timothy 6:9, Paul says that those who desire to be rich fall into a temptation, into a trap. Does this mean that wanting to be rich is a sin? Join me with Malcolm Foley. Hey all, really quickly before we get into things, first of all, thank you so much for listening to the show. We are so excited to help people dive deeper into their study of Scripture, especially by understanding some of the most controversial and confusing passages in the Bible. And that's where we could use your help. If you've benefited or appreciate this show, we would love if you'd be willing to take the time to rate and subscribe on whatever platform you're using to watch or listen. This will help others join us in studying God's Word. With that, let's get back into the episode. Hi, my name is Kirk Miller, and you are listening to What in the Word, a show dedicated to helping you gain confident understanding of some of Scripture's strangest and most challenging passages. We do this with the help of expert guests like today's guest, Dr. Malcolm Foley. Welcome to the podcast, Malcolm.
Thank you, Kirk. It's good to be here.
I am so excited to have you on to discuss today's passage. But before we do that, maybe for guests who are less familiar with you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you serve Christ and His church?
Sure. So I'm the co-pastor of a church called Mosaic Waco in Waco, Texas. We are an intentionally multicultural, gospel-centered, spirit-led church. And I also serve Baylor University as special advisor to the president for equity and campus engagement. Those are some of the ways that I spend my time. I also have a book that just came out 2 months ago. It's called The Anti-Greed Gospel: Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How the Church Can Create a New Way Forward. That's a little bit about me.
Yes, and so that book segues into our topic today. We are going to be discussing 1 Timothy 6, specifically verse 9, but also the surrounding context. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation. Just that bit. That's a little bit of a teaser. Before I say anything more about the passage, obviously this relates to your book topic. We're talking about wealth. We're talking about this desire to be rich.
Yeah.
We're talking about greed. What is the context of this passage in 1 Timothy, though, as we drop into this verse? What's going on here in the book?
So one of the things is Paul's encouraging Timothy with, but especially is warning Timothy about the particular some of the pitfalls that you can fall into, particularly in church leadership. And so he's encouraging Timothy to keep the faith and all these kinds of things. But he's basically just said that one of the things that you really want to avoid is the fact that people see godliness as a path to gain. And so right before this discussion of wanting to become rich, Paul's been talking about contentment. And you can see this in verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. And so that's already like a challenging text for a lot of us to hear today, because we're like, I feel like there's a lot more that I need than just food and clothing. Being content with just food and clothing seems like, I feel like we could do a little better. That's not what Paul says. And in thinking about one of the kind of broader goals of the Christian life, to pair godliness and contentment, that's a good spot. It's a good spot to be in.
Yeah. And let me pull up, I thought it was Yarborough. He had, let me see if I can find that, his chart here.
Charts are great.
Right here. So he has a chart. I know, it's great. Let me zoom out here. He has a chart talking about some of the ways the opening and closing of 1 Timothy compare. And so you see this reoccurrence of the false teachers both at the beginning of the book and the end of the book. They form sort of a top and tail to the entire book, that at the background is this sort of false teaching. Yeah. What's interesting is I'll read the full text here, starting in the second half of verse 2. he charges Timothy again, just like he charged him at the beginning of the book. Teach and urge these things. If anyone teaches a different doctrine, so you teach these things, and if anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that accords with godliness, that sort of teaching, this person is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels. And remember, the elders not to be quarrelsome. So referencing that again, quarrelsome about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction among people who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth. And then this is the key verse that we'll get into. Imagining that godliness is a means of gain, that they see godliness, and we see this today. That people view Christianity or godliness in Christianity as a means of gain. And then here's that contrast. But godliness, what is it actually? It's not a means of gain. It's with contentment. That is great gain. So a bit of a play on words here. The true gain is godliness with contentment. And that's where we brought nothing into the world. We can take nothing out of the world. But if we have food, clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire, those who want to be rich or wealthy, fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, or the love of money is the root of all evil, as the King James says. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So that's our verse. Now, Malcolm, tell me, what makes this a difficult verse?
Well,
what makes it so tough?
I think it's just tough because, well, and I'll go back to what's said at the beginning of the chapter in verse 3. If anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that accords with godliness, I think this is hard for the same reason that the things that Jesus says about wealth are hard, because he's saying the same things, which is that greed is to be avoided. Jesus will say, to keep on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of goods. And Paul is, as he'll do throughout his letters, like he'll echo, even though there's not kind of quotation of the Gospels going on, there's echoing of the words of Jesus kind of throughout each of these texts. And I believe it's in Luke. I think it's Luke 16. Is it 16?
It's about the rich young ruler.
Yeah, I think it's right before. I think it's right before the rich young ruler. And it'll come to me. It'll come to me where it is.
What passage are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of when Jesus says, watch out for all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of goods.
We can use the smart search here.
It will make good use
to locate this verse. But I had done a search.
There you go. Luke 12.
Yeah, there it is. Luke 12:15. This is a good example of when you have a verse in mind, but you're like, what's that reference? We can use the smart search to find it. But he said to them, take care and be on guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possession. But yeah, you're right. Like, as we look at Jesus's teaching, Jesus has some pretty stark teachings on wealth. I think even the parable of the soils, or the sower, as sometimes people say.
Yep.
The idea that
what chokes it? What
chokes it out?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. The goods of this life. And so, yeah, this can be a difficult passage. Maybe the difficulty is less in interpreting what it says. In some ways, it's actually more obvious what it's saying compared to a lot of the passages I discuss on the show. What makes it more difficult is that we may not like what it has to say.
Oh, 100%.
Or we struggle applying it. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about maybe the history of interpretation of this passage, maybe different kind of ways people have dealt with this text.
Yeah, I mean, most of and really this parallels, I think, kind of the way that Christians have broadly thought about wealth in general. So especially in Western context, and especially in Western contexts after after Constantine, you have a number of kind of just in many ways justifications of wealth. So it's that and a kind of softer, in some ways, a softer approach. When you look at a number of the Greek theologians of especially the first 4 or 5 centuries of the church,
Mm-hmm.
there's almost a strident kind of anti-wealth message, and part of it is because some of these folks are coming from monastic backgrounds. Um, but you have folks like you have folks like Basil of Caesarea, who is born in a relatively wealthy Christian family, and then when he gets his inheritance, I mean, he gives up most of it in hearing Christ's words to the rich young ruler to sell all that he has, give to the poor, and come follow him. And there are a number of folks, whether it's Saint Anthony or others, who hear those words of Jesus and hear it spoken to themselves, and they're like, okay, well, that means I got to give up everything I have and go out to the desert. But the thing about the witness, I think, of those individuals is that they are essentially forced into a position where they're like, I have to trust the Lord for my daily bread, which is what we pray for in in the Lord's in the Lord's Prayer. But
Mm-hmm.
we often don't place ourselves in positions where that's actually true, where I'm actually dependent on the Lord. And this is, I think, one of the things that leads to the particular fear that this passage brings up for folks, because they're like, wait a minute, uh, like one of the one of the things that being rich does for me is that I don't have to worry about my material needs being met. And one of the things that seems to be pressed throughout the scriptures is, well, yeah, that's because like God cares for you. Christ has promised to care for you. We'll get to that later. But
Right.
anyway, um, in the way that this text particularly shows up, as you were saying before, the content of it is, there's very little dispute about the content of it. People will debate like what it means. I mean, what it means to be rich.
Right.
And then that will then that obviously informs, well, what does it mean to desire or to wish or to want that, and don't want that. But yeah, this is one of those texts that, I mean, the history of interpretation is pretty consistent in thinking about what it is that Paul said. Um, Now the question of how that actually applies, that's where the spiciness sets in.
Yeah.
And also, like, especially like if you are rich. So and this is another one of the things about First Timothy 6 is that at the end of the chapter,
Right.
it has guidance to people who are rich. So verse 17, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works. Another kind of play on words
Yeah.
there. That it's not that you're seeking to be rich in possessions, seeking to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future. There again, echoing the words of Jesus in storing
Yeah.
up treasures in heaven. And the thing about the way that text, the way that runs, so in Matthew, we're told not to store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. The interesting thing about that text in Matthew is that we're not exactly told like what it means to lay up treasures in heaven. We're just told to kind of do it. In the parallel in Luke, um, let me see. It is either Luke 6 or Luke 12. Um, but
Looks like.
yeah, I think it's 12, and it's a little bit later.
So life is more than
Let's
food.
see. There it is. Okay. 32. Fear not, a little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Verse 33, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. There he's saying, he's very specifically saying that laying up treasure in heaven is selling your possessions and giving to the needy. Like that's what that means. And so whereas the rich young ruler is told to sell everything that he has and give to the poor, what this is indicating is that for every Christian, if you seek to lay up treasure in heaven, it means that it means that you have the regular habit of selling your possessions and giving to the needy, that you're living in that material solidarity with the needy. And so Paul is hearkening back to that even in this text.
Yeah, Luke has a way of doing that oftentimes. This is one of the interesting things about comparing the Gospels is the synoptic Gospels, that is Luke has a way of sometimes being clearer on certain things. I think of the Olivet Discourse where he interprets the abomination of desolation as the army surrounding Jerusalem. And here he doesn't really leave, even Luke's account of the Sermon on the Plain, he says, blessed is the poor rather than blessed is the poor in spirit, as Matthew says. And so Luke gives a special attention to this idea of material possessions. He has the parable, if we call it that, of Lazarus and the rich man. And so, yeah, there's a lot of attention there. I would like to dive into some of the exegetical details of this passage. And so one of the questions, if you could just help unpack what exactly is meant by verse 9.
Yeah.
We have, for instance, those who, I have an interlinear pulled up, those who want to be rich fall into a temptation and so forth. What exactly does Paul mean by this statement?
Yeah. I think so. I think it's a matter of, it's not saying that, it's not saying like, okay, if you want to be rich, just be careful.
Right.
It's saying like, don't desire to be rich because
that's one of the big questions is like, there's two ways that someone could interpret this, right?
Yeah.
Those who want to be rich, they fall into temptation, as in like they're putting themselves into a position to be tempted. But it's like, you know what? If you want to do that, like we're all tempted. So go for it.
Right.
Like, just be careful. That is like I could see someone reading it that way. Or it's the idea of, one, that would be foolish even if you read it that way.
Yeah.
The other idea, though, is that fall into temptation, like this idea of falling. Sorry, I cut you off. But
no, you're good.
This idea of falling is actually saying you succumbed to the temptation. Like to fall, like elsewhere when this word gets used. So if I pull it up in BDAG, of course it can mean like physical falling, but otherwise it is, another idea is to experience a state or condition. And so, for instance, this is where I think it's the parable of the Good Samaritan. He falls into robbers. It's the idea he's not just like making himself susceptible to robbers, but he has actually he's in it. And so here at the very least, it's like you're in the temptation then is the idea of fall. Fall is not like a just watch out, it's a possibility. So anyways, keep going. Walk us through.
And that's the thing. And it'll go into the next verse too, but it's that in that desire to be rich, you fall into temptation and a trap and a number of foolish and harmful desires which then will plunge you even deeper into ruin and destruction. But the way into that hole is the desire to be rich. And once you fall into that hole, you will fall deeper into ruin and destruction, which is to say that definitionally that next verse, when we talk about the love of money, like the love of money and the desire to be rich are the same thing. And so that leads into, like I said, that leads into the next, I think the next verse. but it goes back to like the desire to be rich is framed as the opposite of contentment. It's the opposite
Mm-hmm.
of seeing what the Lord has given you as enough. The desire to overflow materially in this case, um, is I think is a direct contrast to what he's just lauded to what he's just lauded in the previous in the previous verse.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing too, and many commentators will note this. There's a progression here. Those who desire to be rich, what happens? They fall into three things: into a temptation, into a snare. So, and in here, we can pull up. It's interesting to see the text compare the different ways folks translate this verse.
Yeah.
But here, the ESV says a snare. Other translations, they'll say, like the NET says, into a trap, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into destruction. So there's that progression from temptation to now it's like you've fallen and your foot is in the bear trap at this point. Simply by desiring to be rich, that's where you're going. That's either where you already are. You've already fallen and are experiencing that condition, or at the very least, you're sort of falling into a place where this is stated as sort of the inevitable consequence. And then eventually it leads to destruction. And so this is the progression here. It does raise one of the main questions, which you've already sort of hinted at, which is, what does it even mean to be rich? Of course, if the issue is desiring or wanting to be rich, then how do we actually define what constitutes rich? Like, how much is too much? That sort of question.
Yeah. Well, and then we can really determine that, like, from context, like how has Paul just defined contentment? Because
Precisely, yeah.
because we can be content with having what we need provided for us, and the things that he frames as the things that we need are food and clothing. With these we'll be content. And so if we are going to wear ourselves out for more than that, this understanding of what it means to be rich is actually a much broader understanding of what it means to be rich than what a lot of people are comfortable with. And so, but this is the only way that we can get to the point where, where Paul will say in Philippians that I've learned to, I've learned to be rich and in need, and all that text. There we go. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. This is where this is like, he's actually an example of what godliness and contentment look like in a person. And like I said, there's so many intertextual connections, especially in this, in this particular passage.
I was even thinking, as you're talking before with Matthew 6, as you mentioned, like, we have this discussion of laying up treasures in heaven.
Yep.
And then immediately afterwards is
passage.
the do not be anxious about your life, the material aspects of your life. But even right before that, this comes before or right following the Lord's Prayer, where we have the prayer to give us our daily bread. And so it all sort of segues, and we can get into this more when we get into the practical matters too, but just a little bit of a teaser there. Help us walk through the next verse 10 then. This is a more commonly recognized verse. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils, or all evils. How should we understand this verse?
So for the first, it's that just every for the root of every kind, or for the root of every, or I'll say I'll do it like really literally, for the root of all of the evils is philarguria, or the love of money. And it's basically saying that, hey, for a whole bunch of these evils that you see around you, if you were to dig down to their root, what you would find is the love of money. And this
Hmm.
is and then he'll continue by which some desiring this des- desiring it have gone straight from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pains. He's basically drawing Timothy's attention to the fact that, like, you've seen this, like, you've seen some folks around you where they've left the faith because they've essentially served another master. So this goes back to what Jesus says in Matthew 6:24, that you can't serve two masters. You'll either love one and hate the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and mammon is the Aramaic word, but money. It's translated money or riches. It really is, and this is also what I press in the book. Like, I think both Paul and Jesus are serious when they're like, there are two things that are fighting for control over you, and you will either go the way of the Lord, or you'll go into mammon worship. And mammon worship leads you away from the faith and leads you to a whole bunch of pain. And that's why, it's also one of the reasons why this is framed, I think, with the language of love. Like, this is an alternate love to the love of God and love of neighbor, is the love of money. And that love takes you into all these other places where the people of God don't need to be.
Yeah. I'd love to hear your opinion on how to translate this verse too.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the King James, which is maybe sort of in a lot of our thinking, just because it's such a prevalent translation in forming our theological consciousness. It says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." Whereas, like the NASB, let's see, "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil," which is, the NASB reflects what is probably more common. Interestingly, the NET, the New English Translation, does follow, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." So that follows the King James. But a lot of the modern contemporary translations, notice the difference. The root or a root. There is a difference there. To say something is the root is saying, like, that is like definitively what's going on in evil. And then to say all kinds of evil says this gives rise to various evils, versus to say it's the root of all evil is to say, like, this is where it all springs from. Tell us kind of how to work through some of that. And a lot of this does get into the nitty-gritties of the Greek.
Well, here's the other thing. I mean, like, there's a part of me that is very, very deeply sympathetic to it being the root of all evil. Now there's no definite article for in dealing with the word root.
Right.
And so that
you just notice it's just root.
It's just root. And so, so there is an argument for it not being, I said, this definite claim that the only, like, if you were to dig to the root of every single evil, then you would find the love of money every single time. That would be a hard argument to make. But it's an argument that I would love to make because of the way that Jesus frames the two masters discourse, where he's like, he picks, like, he could have picked any other master. He could have said, like, you can't serve both God and Satan. He could have said you can't serve both God and yourself. Like, he could have done any number of those things, but the very specific thing he picks is mammon. And so, like, all of that, I think, makes it not unreasonable to make the claim that when you dig down deep enough for essentially all of our evils, it comes down to this. It comes down to this love of money. But I think there's also a part of us that knows that there are other reasons. There are other reasons that we sin. Other deep reasons that we sin that may not have anything to do with money. So I think what ends up being kind of more faithful to the context is that it is still the root, but it's the root of
all different, kind of a whole bunch of different kinds of evil.
Hmm.
That there is a ridiculous amount of diversity of the kind of sin that follows from the love of money. Um, it's in some ways mind-boggling how many different sins can flow from the love of money. And this goes back to like the temptation and the trap and the many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. It's in many ways just
Yeah,
kind of a restatement. Like it's in many ways a restatement of that that previous verse.
right.
That belonging to be rich, the love of money, leads to a whole bunch of senseless, harmful, sinful desires,
Mm-hmm.
thus evils. And I mean, like literally, like it's basically saying the same thing in verse 9 that he's saying in verses 10 and 11. Some people have
It's a summary statement of it in a
it's
lot of ways.
exactly that, and that people who have fallen into that, it's led to their destruction. They've strayed from the faith.
Hmm.
Yeah, so in many ways, like I said, so where one text may be slightly unclear, I think when it's brought in the context of what's said immediately before, it becomes a little bit more clear.
Hey folks, we'll be right back to the episode. But first, I want to let you know that this show is brought to you by Logos, makers of the most widely used Bible study and sermon preparation platform. Logos is a digital library fused with technology that enables you to study scripture both deeper and faster. And we want to help you deepen your study of tough biblical texts, not only by listening to the show, but also by taking advantage of Logos's exclusive perks for listeners of What in the Word. Check out the link in the show notes to access free stuff, discounts, and other special offers curated to deepen your study of Scripture. Interested? Again, follow that link in the show notes. All right, now back to the episode. Yeah, what's interesting, so the NET is a great resource that has tons of translation notes. They do argue for the definite. This could be taken as a root, because admittedly, when in Greek, when there's not a definite article, there is more involved than just always translating it indefinite. But they argue that way, and they argue that the use of this word all, Pantone, I believe it is, if I'm finding myself. Yeah.
Yep, it's
what they argue that it has to be each and every kind. So they actually do argue that. Interestingly, though, if you look at BDAG, we do see that the word pas can mean every sort of instance of a class, but it can also just mean all different kinds. And so it does allow for that broader interpretation. But I would say, even if it did have that more definite, it is the root of all evil. Paul could also be speaking hyperbolically. That's also a possibility. Yeah. And so that's sort of how we understand verse 10. And then you already mentioned the context as well, but it does bring up the question of what do we do with those who are rich? Because the Bible, like if I pull up a smart search, we have examples of wealthy, godly people. Not golly people, godly people.
Yeah.
And so we have, I think of like Job, for instance, where God actually, first example,
Blameless and upright.
was wealthy. Blameless and upright. And then God at the end of the book restores his wealth. We have Abraham, for instance. So how should we I could see people wanting to, well, one, there's nothing wrong with wanting to interpret scripture with scripture and kind of bring these texts into conversation with each other, but there would also be a way of appealing to those passages to maybe muffle what this text is saying. Because another instance where we have a wealthy individual would be the rich young ruler, where Jesus clearly tells him to sell all he has. So how do we put these in concert with each other?
And I think another one of these examples, and I will have to find it. I'll have to find the text in, I believe, Deuteronomy, where the kings are told not to seek wealth for themselves or chariots, and I'll think about that. But I think about Solomon.
And I think about one of his primary failings was not just the adultery, was just not the adultery. But there we go. Okay, he shall not acquire. So verse 17, in talking about the kings, he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And it's interesting that when people think about the legacy of wealth in the scriptures, one of the other examples that they always think about is Solomon, and how rich he was. And yet the tradition, and yet the scriptural tradition surrounding all of the kings is that like all of the kings are bad. because the people of God were never meant to have a king. This is what they're told in 1 Samuel 8 when they ask for one. God's like, basically, I'm your king. And also, this is what your kings are going to do. They're going to exploit you. They're going to build an army. They're going to take your children. They're going to take your daughters and sons as slaves. All this kind of stuff. And so then when you get the story of the monarchy, you get kind of failed king after failed king after failed king after failed king. One of the failures of Solomon is actually that he disobeys this text, that he amasses excessive gold and silver for himself, as well as the hundreds of wives and concubines thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the and in thinking about Abraham and Job, it is said that they are rich, but not necessarily that they are expending themselves to get rich. So if it's the case that God, which then goes back to the fact that Paul gives guidance to the rich. There are a few ways that you can get rich. You can hoard it for yourselves, or you can inherit it. And one of the things that I think is being said here is like, there are going to be some in your midst who had no control over whether or not they became rich or not. They may have inherited it. And so what do you do if you're in that position of wealth? Well, you see what you have been given as meant to be shared. It's not because the thing about pursuing it is that you pursue it in order to keep it. If it's been given, and in this case, it's like, if you have it, it's meant to be shared. Whatever you have, it's meant to be shared. And so, if you're to seek something, seek to do good, seek to be rich in good works. That's what you ought to expend yourself for. Don't set your, so not only avoiding pride, but avoiding kind of setting your, as they'll say, setting your hopes on the uncertainty of riches. Riches are not they're not a foundation. They're not a foundation for anything. But seeking the Lord and his kingdom, that's a good foundation for the future. Storing up treasures for yourselves in ways that are good foundations for the future. That is, as the proverb says, the one who gives to the poor lends to the Lord. Like that, in using that language of placing the Lord in your debt, that's a pretty good space to be, because the Lord always pays his debts. But not necessarily in saying that like that's the way to get rich, but in saying that that's the way to build an actual lasting foundation.
Yeah, I love verses 17 and following. I love just how Paul states what he's saying, all the play on words. I just love it.
Yeah.
As for the rich, and then notice this, in this present age, like there's a qualification.
Yeah.
Like you're rich, but just in this present
just
age.
For now.
In this contrast, when he says, so that they may take hold of what is truly life.
Mm-hmm.
Like these are subtle ways of saying like, yeah, you're rich, but But what's the true richness that we're talking about? Charge them not to be haughty nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly, the same underlying root there in Greek, he's the one who richly provides us with everything to enjoy.
Yeah.
They are to do good, and where are they to be wealthy? They're to be wealthy in their good works. And how?
Yep.
This is what's interesting, is it fits that what we looked at in Luke, the way that you build up treasure in heaven is to be generous and to share, thus storing up. Paul is interpreting Luke's gospel, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future.
Yep.
And so, yeah, it's a fantastic verse.
And
it shows. Go ahead.
No, I mean, and back to verse 17, that God provides for us all things richly in order that we might enjoy, basically in order that we might enjoy them. And that refocusing on, hey, the one in whom we take joy and in whom we place our foundations, like that's the Lord, because he's the one who gives all things in an abundant way. And that he does that kind of for us to enjoy those things. Like one of the things to continue to affirm is that, like, we serve a God who enjoys giving his people good things. Our focus is on the giver of the gifts, not on the gifts themselves. And whatever the Lord gives us, we're like, okay, well, this is meant for me to both enjoy and to share, but not to hoard. And the temptation with plenty is always to hoard and to keep, just to kind of keep for yourself.
Yeah. And that reminds me of the book of Ecclesiastes, where there is this idea of the Kohelet, the preacher. He goes out, and one of the things he tries is wealth, and is pleasure, and he finds that it is ultimately vanity. It doesn't yield what he's looking for it to yield. It is a chasing after wind. But there are these refrains throughout the book that nonetheless talk about enjoying the gifts that God has given. And so there seems to be a sense in which we can receive something from God, receive it as a gift, and actually enjoy it for what it is. But if we pursue it as the end in and of itself, if we try to make the gift into the giver, it actually spoils the gift from being what it was meant to be all along. And I think it's a helpful comment to say it's not that Paul is saying being rich itself is sinful. He talks about the rich and what they are to do in that condition in which they find themselves. We also have examples of Abraham and Job and such, but there is a pretty stark statement about the desire to be rich. That contrasts with his call to contentment, and he clearly sees that as a no-go. At the very least, if it's not blatantly sinful, it's at least blatantly foolish.
It's funny, isn't it funny in verse 20, the language that Paul uses to basically end the book, where he says, Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Like there's that language is still there, like that language of a trust, which is a financial instrument. Like we understand that as a financial instrument, but the question, but it's not you guarding money. It's you guarding the faith, and that like the value, like the treasure of union, like the treasure of union with Christ is a treasure of far greater worth. And so it's something that is like, that's something that it's worth you not only guarding, but also actively pursuing. So that language, like I said, I think permeates this entire portion of this chapter.
I'd love to, as we kind of head towards our final lap here, is let you talk a bit about just what you think this looks like practically on the ground in a local church. What does it actually, like, what's the practical significance of this passage, which we've already been talking about? So maybe if I could like sharpen the question, is just like, how do we actually put this into practice? What would that look like, putting these things into practice?
So one thing is actually asking the question, which is a question that we don't often ask, of like, what do I need? And as I look at my own budgeting process and stuff like that, how much of that is really just focused on extra
stuff, how much of that is really just me focused on building treasures in like storing up treasures in places where moth and rust is actually going to eat away. So like one possible practice is, okay, let me look at all the money that I might spend on things that I want, and let me match that with what I'm going to spend to meet the needs of others. And what's going to happen is you're going to end up spending less on yourself and more on other people than you do right now. But you will also find that there's actually more joy to be found in storing up treasures where in heaven, where they won't fade. Then there's more joy in doing that than there is in doing all this stuff that you think that kind of doing all this stuff that you think that you want. But that's also a way of just being obedient to how Christ has called us to see our resources, that they're meant fundamentally for us that insofar as we're given more than we need, that's meant for us to meet the needs. It's meant for us to meet the needs of others. If we can invest in using our creativity to that end, rather than Basil, in one of his sermons to the rich, where he's reflecting on the rich young ruler conversation, he'll basically say that the devil has orchestrated a whole bunch of different ways for us to spend our money that are just essentially frivolous, and so he loves to see us fritter it away in those spaces. But what the Lord would have us do is to see everything that he gives us as meant not only for his glory, but also for the good of our neighbors, brothers and sisters, and even enemies. If you were to ask the question, well, like, what do I need? And Lord, what might it look like for me to use everything that I don't need for the benefit of others? I think it'll lead to a more simple life, but also a more joyful life, one that is much more saturated with the love of God and the love of neighbor, and one that actively resists mammon worship, because mammon would love for us to not think about it, and thus fall into its trap and snare,
to take it for granted.
So yeah.
Yeah, it calls into question the category of luxury, if luxury is defined as sort of excess of unnecessary splurging, we might say. I also wonder, even as we look at the book of Acts, and we look at what this looked like for the local church in Jerusalem, the idea of having all things in common. We see that in the end of Acts 2, I believe. And in Acts
4.
Is it Acts 4:30? And so we see that even with Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 5, that is on the heels of that. And so there is, or even Acts 6, when they're distributing to the widows, there is this, or in 1 Timothy, chapter 5, the book that we're in, this idea of caring for the widows there. So there is ways that the church within the New Testament itself was implementing this caring for others. How do you see
2 Corinthians
this
8
looking like? Even across churches
in the call from Macedonia. So sorry, go ahead.
No, that's right. So how do you see, like, what would this look like for a church to live out? You're a pastor. So, like, what does it look like to actually have a church live out these things on the ground?
Two things are present. You're building a community where people are willing to ask for help, which is one of the most significant obstacles, especially in American churches, because we're in a political economy that encourages us to seek self-sufficiency in all ways, and if we're not self-sufficient, then we're failures. And so that like it atrophies the muscle in us of asking for help. When the gospel reminds us that we're all needy people, that we're regularly in need, but that God has gathered a people to meet those needs, to help us to meet those needs. So it starts with that building an ethos of people who are willing to ask for help, but then parallel to that is also building that ethos of sharing, of people recognizing that, hey,
Like, how am I actively looking to share kind of every day of my life? So am I looking at the things that I have and thinking primarily, what's the best way for me to share? What's the best way for me to share these things? Because that's the image because that's the image of the incarnation. The Son of God takes on flesh in order to share everything that he has with us, including, if we read the book of Revelation right, including his very throne. And I'll do this very briefly because it's my favorite verse in the entire Bible. and it's Revelation 3:21. And Jesus talking to the church at Laodicea, and he says, to the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. That is the promise of union with Christ, is that Christ will share everything that he has with you, even the very throne on which he sits with the Father, which is insane. It's absolutely insane. But when that's the paradigm, and this is what book 2 is going to be, but when that's so everybody, you're getting a sneak peek. But when that's the paradigm for the way that you think about resources and power, whatever, that gives you the freedom. It gives you the freedom to share because you've seen what it is that the Lord has prepared for you. There's no reason to hold on so tightly to something that has been relativized in that significant of a way.
Yeah, it makes me like, your book is titled The Anti-Greed Gospel. It's not just anti-greed for the sake of being anti-greed.
Yeah.
It's the gospel is what's meeting that greed.
Yep.
It makes me think of 2 Corinthians 8, I think it's chapter 8, where it says that though he was rich, he became poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich.
Yep.
We united to Christ, we have everything. And so that liberates us to unleash that sense of generosity because of how much we've been given. And so if left to our own strength, greed is too strong for us to be able to resist and put up a wall against. But the gospel is what's actually going to enable us to be generous.
It's why
because the gospel itself is generous. It is a generous act of God.
It's why we're reminded in Colossians that our life is hidden with Christ in God. And we're told that when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Like it's this continuing affirmation that Christ is my life.
Yeah, that's so good. This was so much fun to talk about. I hope folks pick up your book, The Anti-Greed Gospel. Thank you so much for joining us, Malcolm.
Thanks, Kirk.
Before you head out, can I have your attention for one more brief moment? We're so glad you joined us as we dive deeper into God's Word, wrestling with some of the Bible's most difficult and debated passages. We'd love for this material to be available to as many people as possible, and there's an easy way you can help us with that. If you found today's episode valuable, we'd love if you'd be willing to review and subscribe on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch this material. And if you feel especially generous, maybe consider even sharing today's episode on your social media or texting some friends and family. Also, we don't claim to have the corner on the market when it comes to interpreting the Bible. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts and what you think about today's passage. Did you find our interpretation convincing, or what view do you find most persuasive? Let us know in the comments. All right, until next time.